Richard was born with fire in his blood and steel in his spirit. His cry as a child was like the roar of a beast, and the world already whispered of his fate. His mother Eleanor of Aquitaine filled his mind with the pride of kings, and his father Henry gave him the hunger for power. Yet Richard walked his own path. He was not made for courts or for whispers. He was made for the battlefield, where men proved themselves by the edge of the sword. As a youth he learned the weight of armor and the sting of wounds. He trained until his arms were strong as iron and his legs swift as the hunting stag. He was tall and broad, his hair shone in the sun, his eyes burned with fury when he fought his brothers. He gave no quarter when he challenged barons. He broke their pride, for Richard feared no man, and every clash sharpened the lion within him. When Henry died, the crown passed to Richard, and with it the power of England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. Yet Richard did not sit upon the throne in sloth. His soul longed for battle, his heart longed for the Holy Land, where the crescent had taken Jerusalem from the cross. He raised his banner, he called his knights, he forged alliances, and he gathered gold and steel for the great crusade. The sea journey began with storms that tossed the ships like leaves upon the wind. Waves roared like dragons in fury, yet Richard stood upon the deck unmoving. He calmed his men not with gentle words but with the promise of triumph. He swore that the sea itself could not drown the Lionheart. When pirates struck from the isles, Richard met them with fury. He boarded their ships, he cut down the captains, his sword flashing like lightning, his shield battering men into the deep. The waters ran red and the pirates fled before him. At Messina in Sicily unrest boiled, and enemies thought to test the new king, but Richard's wrath was swift. His men stormed the city gates, they clashed in the narrow streets, blades ringing against blades, fire rising from the roofs. Richard himself rode through the chaos, cutting down those who defied him, until the city bent to his will and peace was hammered into place by the strike of his sword. The voyage continued to Cyprus, where the ruler sought to trick and betray the Crusaders. Richard answered with steel. His men stormed the island, his banner rose above the castles. The enemy knelt before him in fear, for none could match his will. Thus Cyprus became his prize, a jewel wrested from treachery by the force of his hand. At last the Lionheart reached the Holy Land, and the walls of Acre loomed before him high and defiant. The Saracens within mocked the Crusaders, who had failed to take the city for long months. Yet when Richard arrived, the siege became fire. Engines of war hurled stones that shook the earth, towers burned, arrows darkened the sky. Richard commanded with thunder in his voice, and when the time came he led the charge himself. He climbed the ladders, his shield raised, his sword striking down defenders. The gates broke, the walls shattered, the city fell, and Acre belonged to the cross once more. But mercy was not given to those who betrayed oaths. Richard gathered the prisoners who had refused to yield their promises, and with grim justice he ordered them struck down before the walls, so that all would know the Lionheart was merciful only to the loyal and ruthless to the false. His name spread like flame across the east, both feared and revered. From Acre Richard marched south through scorching deserts, his men weary beneath the burning sun. Yet Richard rode among them, never asking what he would not endure himself. When the Saracens struck with swift raids, their horsemen swarming like locusts, Richard countered with iron discipline. His lines held firm, his knights struck like thunder when the time was right, and the enemy broke upon them again and again. At Arsuf the armies met in a battle that shook the earth. Saladin brought forth his might, his horsemen charged, his archers filled the sky with arrows. The Crusaders bent but did not break, and Richard rode at the heart of the storm. His voice rose above the chaos, his banner shone like fire. He called the charge, and the knights thundered forth. Templars, Hospitallers, warriors of every land united beneath his command. They smashed into the Saracen line, shields splintered, lances pierced armor, swords rang out, and Richard fought like a titan, his blade cutting a path through the tide, his shield turning aside the fiercest blows. Men fell before him, champions sought him out, and he cast them down one by one. The field of Arsuf belonged to Richard. The Saracens fled, the Crusaders rejoiced, and songs of victory rose in every camp. Men said the Lionheart had no equal on earth. He was king and knight, he was storm and steel, he was the living spirit of war. Yet Richard did not rest, for the march continued toward Jaffa and Jerusalem. The sands drank sweat and blood, the sun punished all alike, yet Richard pressed onward, his courage unbroken, his will like stone. Saladin struck again with ambushes, riders sweeping out of the dunes, but Richard answered with cunning and fury. He lured them close, then unleashed the charge. His knights thundered forth and trampled the raiders into dust. One night in the desert the Saracens sent a band of chosen warriors to strike Richard's camp. They crept in silence. They thought to cut down the Lionheart in his tent, yet Richard was awake, his sword already in hand. He strode into the dark, his armor gleaming in the firelight. He cut down the first intruder, he smashed the second to the ground. The camp roused to his roar, his men rallied to him, and together they slaughtered the raiders, leaving none alive. The desert itself echoed with the fury of his triumph. The march was long, the hardships many, yet Richard never faltered. He drove his men forward with the strength of his example, and the promise of glory for the holy city of Jerusalem lay ever before them, shining like a crown beyond the horizon. The march to Jerusalem dragged on, and the men of the cross grew weary, yet Richard carried their hope upon his shoulders. He knew Saladin would not yield without fury, and so the Lionheart sharpened his sword and prepared for storms to come. The land was cruel, the heat pressed down like a furnace, and the enemy struck with endless raids, yet Richard answered every strike with fire. At Jaffa the sea roared as Saracen ships landed, warriors who swarmed upon the shore. The walls of the city shook as enemy soldiers poured through. Fire rose and despair spread, but within the chaos Richard was unshaken. He mounted his horse, his banner high. He called to the few who stood with him, and they charged into the flood. His sword flashed brighter than the sun, each stroke a death blow. His shield turned aside blades that would have ended lesser men. The enemy recoiled before him, yet more pressed on, and the streets ran with blood. Richard fought through them all, his knights rallied at his side. Together they carved the foe into ruin and drove them back into the sea. Jaffa was saved, and the name of the Lionheart thundered across Christendom. Saladin tried again. He sent forth his finest riders, armed with blades curved like the crescent moon. Swift and deadly they thundered across the plains, seeking the head of the English king, but Richard met them in open ground. He spurred his horse forward, his lance lowered. The first rider fell impaled upon his steel, his sword cut down the second with a stroke that split shield and mail. His shield smashed the third into dust. The rest turned in awe, for they faced not merely a man but a lion crowned with glory. Still the holy city lay beyond their reach. The men were torn with quarrels, allies failed him, and the strength of his army waned, yet Richard never yielded. He struck whenever he could. He led raids that burned enemy camps. He ambushed riders in the dunes. He stormed towers and fortresses, each clash adding fire to his legend. Saladin himself admired the courage of his foe, and in his tent he said, "There has never been such a king as this Lionheart, who fights like 10,000. The time came when both warriors, weary of endless strife, forged a truce. Jerusalem would remain with Saladin, yet pilgrims could walk its streets in peace. It was a peace not born of weakness but of respect, for each had tested the other in battle and found no shame. Richard returned not with the city in his hand, but with his name upon the lips of the world, a name of valor that none could deny. Yet his tale did not end with the East. On his journey home fate betrayed him. He was captured by the hand of the emperor and held in chains, yet even in chains Richard's legend grew, for the world trembled at his captivity. Kings and princes bartered for his freedom, until at last the Lionheart was loosed again to ride and to fight. In his final days he turned his sword against the foes of his realm. In France he laid siege to castles, his spirit unbroken, his fire undimmed, yet destiny struck not with the blade of a champion but with the bolt of a crossbow. An arrow pierced his flesh, the wound festered, yet Richard did not bow. He stood tall even as death crept upon him. His men gathered around, and he looked upon them with the pride of a king who had never feared battle. He spoke not of regret but of glory. He died as he had lived, with the courage of a lion, with the heart of a warrior, his name roaring across the centuries, his victories carved in stone, his deeds sung in every hall. From England to Jerusalem, from Acre to Jaffa, from the castles of France to the deserts of the East, Richard the Lionheart, the king who fought like no other, the king who made the world tremble, the king who became legend.